adults are needed in that process to give the shock absorber its strength, because if a shock absorber is too flexible, it'd break, but if it's too strong and inflexible, then it would break. So there's a good partnership between young people and old people in the church where they both generate new ideas together. And we call that, we've formed a new term for that we call generative intergenerational ministry.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Chip Lunch Podcast. It is great to have you along with us, and I have one of our co-hosts with us today. Stu, welcome.
Hello, Joel.
Are you well?
I'm very well.
Only a Sharks hat today. Last week was all Sharks regalia.
Oh, yes. I was double branded last week.
What did you say about being double branded?
Oh, it's just I don't know if it's a personal rule or if it's a widely held fashion choice, but I think if you do have a branding, you tend to not want to wear too many brands. Some people don't wear brands at all these days, which is, I often don't wear brands, but if I do wear something like a Sharks hat, I try not to wear another shark item of clothing at the same time, or I might look like a tragic shark tragic.
Why is that bad?
I don't know. That's why I said it might just be a personal preference, because I think it's a bit over the top. So yeah, I do it with surf stuff as well. If I'm wearing something with a Quicksilver brand on it, I probably would hesitate to wear two items of clothing with Quicksilver. I don't know. Maybe it's a phobia. Maybe I don't know.
Well, there's an element in Liverpool fan culture, because I'm a Liverpool supporter, is that you don't wear the jersey.
That's right.
You wear casual fan culture of England, which is interesting.
Yes, it's cooler to do that.
Yeah.
The shirters, as we're known in England, are the everyday fans that wear the shirt of their club.
Are they called Wolves? There's another one. Oh no, there's out of towners and stuff like that.
Is there? Yeah, right. But I do. Yeah, I support Sheffield Wednesday, and within Sheffield Wednesday, there's a core group of fans that don't wear the shirts, and they call the rest of us shirters because we wear the jerseys. So yeah, that's another fun thing. Actually, when I was in England to see Sheffield Wednesday play. Who did they play? Norwich in the qualifier for us to get back in the Premier League about 7 years ago, I think it was. And my dad and my brother and I flew over for the game, which was very gratuitous, but also a wonderful blessing that our family was okay with it. Yeah, well, I grew up as a little kid here, and my dad, who's from Sheffield, talked about how much he loves Sheffield Wednesday. And
he went to
my brother,
at Hillsborough, didn't he?
He went to Hillsborough all the time, yeah. But Dad bought Greg and I our first shirts in the late 70s, so we've been mad fans since then. But we always talked as a family how cool it'd be to see Sheffield Wednesday play at Wembley with Dad, and so they were playing at Wembley, so we took Dad and we went to see England play Australia, because there happened to be an international game on the Friday, and we drove up to Sunderland to watch that, and then we came back down to London the next day to watch Sheffield Wednesday Norwich, and it was quite amazing to see 40,000 Sheffield Wednesday fans, because a lot of my friends in Australia think that Sheffield Wednesday has a fan base that can fit in a telephone box, and that's kind of true in Australia, but over in Sheffield there's a mad base. And yeah, to be there in Wembley with 40,000 Wednesday fans and, 30,000 Norwich fans, it was quite unreal. So, but anyway, just to talk about the shirt thing, I was having a pie wearing my Sheffield Wednesday jersey outside Wembley, sitting next to a Norwich fan, and a group of nondescript young men came over to me with Sheffield accents and said, "You might not want to be sitting next to that bloke." And I just went, "Oh, what's the problem?" And then when I revealed that I had an Australian accent, they said, "Look, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt because you're an out-of-towner, but we don't mix with those people, and you belong to us, so you'd better come over here with us." And I'm like, "Hang on, this is I'm sitting here eating a pie. I'm an Australian. I can sit wherever I want. I'm about to say to these blokes, how about you go and just leave me alone?" Nicely. But the guy next to me looked at me and goes, "You're not in Australia anymore, man." And he said, "I'll move." And he walked off.
The Norwich fan.
Yeah, the Norwich fan. And then the kids went, well, they were kids. They were like 18-year-olds, but they were all wearing the same brand. Funnily enough, it didn't have a logo, but I got told later all the in-group at Sheffield Wednesday all wear the same clothes from the same shop. It's funny, isn't it? Because they're trying to distinguish themselves as a group away from the rest of the fans, but they're all wearing the same thing anyway, which I think is quite ironic. But anyway, yeah, I was kind of like, wow, these guys are kind of threatening me, and I'm a Sheffield Wednesday fan. So that was me being looked down on as a shirter, I think. Yeah,
it's fascinating the way that we still live out tribal.
Yeah, it's very tribal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is kind of relevant for today, actually, what we're going to be talking about.
Yes, well, we speaking of gathering a group of people together, we had our annual general meeting.
Yes, we did.
On
very salubrious.
Yeah, it's very good. It's got quite a lot of people there. It was a great turnout.
Yeah, it was a good turnout. It was good. There's a lot of young people there too, which was really encouraging.
Yeah, that was. And it's a kind of interesting, I think it's cool that you get to kind of be part of a democratic process of electing not just our parish council, but also our nominators and things like that. I think that's really cool. I know that you believe in it very strongly as well.
Yeah,
and it comes from probably from your political science days and stuff like that too.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a political science nerd. Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. But what were any thoughts that you want to think about that you got from the night? Yeah,
I was interested from 2 points of view, and we were talking about this before the podcast. I was thinking about this is a regular thing that we do every year to have an AGM, as many organisations do. And I was reflecting on it before our AGM that we've probably, as Anglican churches, been having these for hundreds of years probably. But then it was also interesting to reflect on how times change, where you've got this formal institutional framework of an AGM where you have elections and you have all the stuff that happens in an AGM. But then year to year, it can be very different contexts that we're having in. And we were talking a bit earlier about the current fuel crisis, I suppose you could call it, without exaggeration. I think it seems to be becoming that since the Iran war, and fuel prices are going up, and there's this context of, is the war going to finish? Straits of Hormuz are closed, and is that going to mean that the petrol prices are going to flow into grocery prices, and is that going to affect people's jobs? And so all that's probably in the back of the minds of everybody who came to the AGM. But in the minutiae of our Anglican polity, we were also needing to, as usual, we prayed, we read some scripture, we're trusting in God's generosity and kindness to us. And as we are experiencing different challenges this year that we might have had from last year, we still look towards God's providence. And we're also looking towards thinking, how do we live out our Christian collective communal experience as individual Christians coming together as a local church to express the reality that we are the brothers and sisters coming together, and God is our Heavenly Father who's looking after us. So, yeah, I found that really interesting, that juxtaposition between what's happening in the wider context with there's something quite comforting, that's a better word, of just going through the motions of regular Christian polity in the midst of all that. I think that was what was front of my mind. Yeah,
and I think speaks to the foundational truths of the gospel as well. They always stay the same, and that's a good way to lay the foundation for the rest of the episode. We're going to talk about, and I want to ask you about this too, the they call it a senior pastor's address. Is that what you did?
Yeah, something like that.
You have to speech.
Rector's address, presbyter's address, I don't know. But a senior pastor does give an address. Yeah, that's true.
Well, in that
traditionally,
you talked about organic and institutional structures and how we operate with that, and that's kind of why we do this podcast. Is kind of we're doing those things. That's what the Abosrber is. And then we've got some questions from Julie, who commented on one of our videos about the friendship circles idea that we've brought from Bonhoeffer, which again is that institutional and organic structures as well.
Yeah, good point.
And then how do we do that as a church when we've got this the fuel crisis may be coming?
Yes,
So that's the through line.
They all connect, don't they? Yeah, actually, that's really cool when that happens.
That's the through line of the episode. But tell us, to start with, the difference between organic and institutional structures and how they're not. I think one of your points was they're not opposed to each other. They can work together. I think that's where you were trying to go.
Yeah. Your correct. Address. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So last week I wrote an article that I published in Substack, if anybody's interested in having a read of it. And we also put it in our church newsletter as a bit of a preparation for the AGM. And what we thought we'd do in this year's AGM is have a reflection on how our church governance works as we came to the AGM. And the reason we wanted to do that was because we wanted to say that we have these formal Anglican structures as a church, but every church in its local expressions develops organic structures as well. And organic structures might be things that a local expression develops through its context of discipleship and mission. So every church has different cultural expressions that it has. And what's really nice about being Anglican is that there's this formal structure that is over the top of a local church. It's really good for accountability. It's really good for running efficient, safe ministry. And then added to that, there are informal ways that people operate that they've developed to help make sense of sharing the truth and love of Jesus in their local context. And so what I did in the article the week before our AGM was just remind people of a bit of our history and our journey as a church, that we live in a particular era, we live in a particular part of the world, and as Christians living in Australia, in Sydney and in the Sutherland Shire, which is in the south of Sydney, we have a particular context that we have been trying to work out for the last 30 years. How do we share the truth and love of Jesus, disciple one another, to be on mission together in our area? And how do we connect up with other areas beyond our area as well? So I had a bit of fun with that by talking about I was going to explain how we developed the shock absorber to help us have an informal strategy that we can use in our context for discipleship and mission that works together with our formal context of being Anglican. So those two things don't have to be in conflict with each other. They can complement each other. So I've already used the analogy of a car quite often. And when we talk about the shock absorber, we said that just like a car drives down the road and it needs shock absorbers to absorb the bumps in the road, so young people in the church are kind of a cultural shock absorber for the church as we travel through time and we experience cultural shocks. It's widely accepted in literature that young people often have cultural flexibility more than adults do, and so they can be like a host to us to explain cultural change, and that a shock absorber needs to be flexible and strong, so adults are needed in that process to give the shock absorber its strength, because if a shock absorber is too flexible, it'd break, but if it's too strong and inflexible, then it would break. So there's a good partnership between young people and old people in the church where they both generate new ideas together. And we call that, we've formed a new term for that we call generative intergenerational ministry, because there are some authors that talk about young people generating new ideas, like Kenda Creasy-Dean, and there's some other authors like Erik Erikson who have commented on how adults can be generative and come up with generative ideas that can help churches to adapt to change. But bringing those two things together is something that I'm doing in my PhD, which I'm hopefully getting to near the end of and be able to publish down the track. But what we did in the newsletter last week and in the Substack was try and talk about the journey towards discovering that intergenerational cooperation that we have in the shock absorber. And instead of using a car again, last week I had fun with the Yellow Submarine, which is a Beatles song from 1967, and talked about the fact that when that song came out, that was a vision for a relational, adaptive community that's travelling together, journeying together, but under the surface of everyday community. And in their context, the Yellow Submarine was a symbol for the hippie subculture that was attempting to come up with new solutions to living within the context of a formal society. But as I point out in the article, the problem with the Yellow Submarine is it can be institutionalized and stop being flexible. And I used the analogy and the metaphor to say that youth ministry practices when I was growing up were developed 20, 30 years before my time, and were similar to the 1960s when the Yellow Submarine was made. The Jesus movement ideas of youth group were still prevalent in the early 90s. And I made the point that we needed a new submarine, a new Yellow Submarine for Gen X. So what we talked about at our AGM was what did we learn from creating that new submarine, And it led us to intergenerational ministry. So instead of the pattern of the church growth movement in the 70s being separating generations into separate groups within a church, like traditional service for old people, contemporary service for families, a young person service in the evening for young people, we said, what if all our services were actually intergenerational? And funnily enough, that was very countercultural at the time, and I think still remains to be a bit countercultural. So the countercultural move in the 60s was to have an expression that was for young people, symbolised by the 4 Beatles travelling along in their Yellow Submarine together as young people discovering life and experiences together as a subculture within the broader adult population. But that view has become the old submarine that we grew up under, and particularly in the church, where we have the DNA from that generation gap that was created in the 60s represented in the way we do church today. So what is countercultural to an extent now is to have the generations come together, because it's actually quite unusual for young people and adults to be friends with each other in a church in safe ways. So that was a bit of a precursor to the meeting on Wednesday. But then on Wednesday, I dug deeper into that idea and talked about how do you organise intergenerational ministry in a Yellow Submarine model of intergenerational ministry in that new submarine. And so what I did was I talked about the fact, again, that the church is a community journeying together. And this time I played with the metaphor a little bit, and I said we're journeying together beneath the surface of daily life, absorbing significant cultural pressures while remaining fruitful to the gospel. So I made the point that the submarine shock absorbers is the hull that can protect it from the huge pressures of cultural change, which is just a bit of a tweak on the shock absorber thing that I've done before. But I've said the way that the shock absorber works, and I've gone a bit deeper into this terminology on Wednesday, which is what we need in the church is we need top-down institutional voices, and we also need bottom-up organic youth voices in church leadership, not just within the church. And so that's what generative intergenerational approach is grappling with. And we're not saying that we've made it completely work and it's working really well. It is a journey and it's aspirational. And that's why I like the Yellow Submarine, because that was a vision of what could be, not necessarily we're always there yet. But we talked a bit about an all-age, all-stage church being powered by the shock absorber, linked to this Yellow Submarine analogy, is actually countercultural to what I called the attractional church models that we often see around us as a church. So not only is an intergenerational church countercultural to the broader culture, but it can be a little bit countercultural to the way a lot of us do church in Sydney today. So what I drew attention to in the talk, which I won't go over completely, and I think I'm probably going to have a Substack article on this prepared soon if people want. We could probably link it in the show notes. Yep. But basically I just showed that an attractional church did come up because of the cultural changes of the 60s, and it was like a seeker-sensitive movement that was popularised by Willow Creek, for example, with Bill Hybels. He wrote a book called Becoming a Contagious Christian in 1994, and a lot of churches were really trying to get their head around how do we use this idea of helping people who don't usually go to church come to church when the culture of the church is so different. So one approach is to be attractional and say, let's make the church attractional. So Bill Hybels' big thing was people are used to turning up to their local Westfield and there's a really clean car park. So if they turn up to the church and it's not clean and it's not convenient, they're probably going to turn around and not stay. When they come into the church, if they hear music that's not professionally presented and quality music that they'd hear at a nightclub or at a concert or in a movie theatre, then they'll probably think it's a bit dodgy and not want to hang around. That was kind of the logic. And I made the point in the talk that came from the homogeneous unit principle, that came from the pin-up boy of the church growth movement, Donald McGavran. And he said people like to become Christians without crossing racial, linguistic, or class barriers. And so that's kind of a logic that a lot of people my age and older have grown up with. So for the last 60 years, a lot of Christians have bought into this idea that we kind of need to make the church a bit more like the world so that people can come to church. So that's how I kind of presented the idea of the Yellow Submarine, because we've actually turned our back on that logic. Instead of going for the clean car park and the professional music, we obviously don't want to have a dirty car park, but at the end of the day, if someone comes and there's, it's not as professional as Westfield, then we don't feel like we need to compete with Westfield or compare ourselves to that. And there's a bit of literature out there that backs up this idea that we have. It's not just come from us, but I shared some of the things that I've come across over the years, like Skip Bell, for example, who wrote the article, What is Wrong with the Homogeneous Unit Principle? And why he talks in that article about why the HUP, as he calls it, the Homogeneous Unit Principle, getting like groups together for like church services doesn't really work in the 21st century. Bell argues that the approach has not only been interesting from describing human behaviour point of view, but it's also been used by the church as a guide for mission and church strategy. And Bell argues that this Willow Creek kind of strategy, this idea of making the church like the world a bit to make the cultural barriers less, as McGavran said, that strategy actually is to offer different cultural expressions of ministry that appeal to people at various ages and stages who prefer to attend church with people who are like themselves. And so what he goes on to say is, he says a lot about it, but he goes on to say that, he asks the question, is this model truly fostering costly discipleship where believers carry their cross as missionaries in their communities, or does it risk actually diluting the gospel? And one more person who's wrote about this is Karina Karemsky, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, and she wrote an article called The Fallacy of the Homogeneous Unit Principle, and she says that the HUP took from behavioural psychology and marketing principles, applying them to the church in order to produce more quantitative growth. And she says, is it a good idea for us to adopt cultural trends from business and marketing that actually make us more pragmatic, more consumeristic, and more hedonistic? And she says that Christians have often taken on this attractional Christianity uncritically. So I made the point in my talk just to say that I think a lot of us in the room will be uncritically thinking that the attractional model is what should guide our governance. So yes, we have these formal structures from the Anglican Church that are 400 years old, but then the strategy or the organic structures should be around giving everybody their voice from all the different generations. Maybe generations could potentially be coming to AGMs to compete with resources against other generations. There could be feelings in some AGMs that one particular demographic might be overrepresented, and that's not fair. And so why we were a Yellow Submarine is I was trying to argue for, if we are to clear the decks on that attractional church model and look for a new Yellow Submarine and think about this shock absorber that we use, how can we be in line with what Jared Wilson says and have a gospel-driven church that's actually uniting around not the status quo in our society, but it's able to create, or not create, but express worship and ministry that is shaped around the values and the desires of the gospel rather than the potential consumers who are going to come and consume the gospel. Can we be servants? And that's what I basically presented. And if you're interested, we could talk some more about what I then went on to say about our organic structures and how we've structured that, which is kind of like the engine room for the submarine. But yeah, it was really interesting. I had a lot of talks with people afterwards who were quite interested in the idea that we were so countercultural compared to some of the churches around us, as well as the culture around us too. So we have the same theology as other churches, but just that different intergenerational strategy.
I feel like sometimes what people say to us about Abosrber is, oh, you're just all organic. But I feel like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like we are utilising the institutional structures that we have in order to create organic structures underneath. Would that be?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So in the article, that's exactly what I do. So I started off on Wednesday as well, saying that Soul Revival is an Anglican church. So I started off by looking at what are our top-down institutional structures. So we talked about the fact that as an Anglican church, we planted in 2013 under evangelism in new churches. And I was given a license by the Archbishop to be the senior minister. But then I had to actually go back to Moore College because I hadn't been ordained as a presbyter. I've only been ordained as a deacon. Not to go into the minutiae of that, particularly for our listeners and viewers that don't actually happen to be in an Anglican context. But in our context, I thought it was really important that we make sure that I'm qualified as a formal rector. While I was in E&C, interestingly, Bruce Hall, who was the head of E&C, was actually our formal rector for 4 years while I did Moore College again. Even though I'd done earlier study, I had to go back and do the whole thing again. But once I graduated, then I was able to be ordained from a deacon that I already was to a presbyter. So that's a very important formal structure. Even while we were waiting for me to be ordained, we set up a parish council, we set up wardens, we set up nominator elections, we set up synod representatives, all those kind of elections, so that we could actually bring our church in line politically and theologically and structurally in line with our broader Anglican context. We also did safe ministry training, and we put all that in practice. So they're all the kind of examples, and there's more, but they're the examples of the formal structures.
There's a lot of
that we adopted.
Accountability with that too.
Heaps of accountability. I mean, this is the great thing. When we planted our church, Soul Revival, I remember Matt Redman, who was one of our co-founders, drew a triangle for us one planning day, and he said, when we got to think about what kind of church we're going to be, we need to put the Bible at the top of that triangle, and on the bottom left corner we put tradition, and on the bottom right-hand side of we write culture. And in Matt's view, which I thought was really helpful, and he got it from somewhere, but I'm not sure where, but he said, we carry with us traditions from the Anglican Church and also older experience of Soul Revival. And that's kind of like our, the traditions from the Anglican Church, like our formal stuff. How we react to cultural change is like our organic stuff. And I thought that was a really helpful model. So on Wednesday I started off with, we are Anglican, we planted our church Anglican, and then when I graduated as presbyter, we had a vote to continue to apply to become what's called a recognised church. At the synod, the year that we established that, we had a presentation before synod and we were accepted by the Archbishop and by the synod, by the regional council, all that kind of stuff happened. So the accountability there is really cool. And also we're taking good ideas from the past that are helping 250 other churches in the Sydney diocese work really well. So it makes heaps of sense not to reinvent that wheel. But then when it's like, how do you apply that in the Sutherland Shire? That's where our organic structures come, and we can talk about that if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, one of the things I know is that we have the council, the Soul Revival Council, where all our ministry representatives or ministry head, kind of the leaders of our ministry teams are part of. Is there anything else that is worth mentioning for that?
Yeah, so the breakdown within the formal structure is I, as the presbyter or senior minister, also we call that position a rector in the Anglican Church, I have purvey over the ministry and the people who are appointed to ministry in the church. And I can delegate ministries, but at the end of the day, I'm responsible to my Archbishop for the safe running of and theological soundness of the church. That's just a summary of it. Yeah. Now, in the formal structure of the Anglican Church, the wardens and the parish council are responsible for finances, facilities, and for legals. So the really cool dynamic that the Anglican Church has set up is the minister is responsible for ministry, and there is a great deal of authority in that eldership position because the minister can preach without fear and be able to preach the gospel, and is given authority there. The check on that minister, so that that minister doesn't be the only person in authority, is the wardens are responsible for supply, I suppose you could say. So the supply comes from the donations at Soul Revival. We don't get any external funding at all. It all comes from the parishioners. And that money is stewarded by the wardens and the parish council. So that's 3 wardens, 1 appointed by me, which is Adam Darvell. We also have 2 elected, Hayden and Leone. Then we had an election that night for whether we have a parish council, how big is a parish council, and we went for 6, and then 6 people were elected out of 10 people who put their names forward. So that 6, together with the wardens, are then responsible for the money in the facility, and they have authority over that. So they then say to me how much money I have to spend, and how I spend that money and how I organise the ministry needs to be biblical, and it needs to be complementing the formal structure. But what I've done is I've gone, well, I can actually structure that ministry into an organic local church expression. And we call that our Soul Revival Council. So what I've done with the Soul Revival Council is we have a Soul Revival Council executive that meets once a month before the parish council. And what we do is we get the formal structure of the parish council to meet together with the pastors and the ministry leaders of the church. So the elected representatives are meeting with those other 2 groups, that are the other 2 groups being the ministry teams of the church with the financial facility team of the church. Now, what's good about that is it means I'm not the only person who talks to all those groups of people. And I did experience once, years and years ago, where I was in a staff meeting and our minister said, hey, I was at parish council and I talked about this idea. What do you guys as staff think about it? And we said, well, if the parish council think it's a good idea, then yeah, let's go for it. And then apparently he then went to the parish council and said, hey, this is an idea the staff and I talked about on Friday. What do you think? And the parish council said, well, if the staff think it's a good idea, then let's go for it. And on the Sunday, I was in the car park and one of the parish councillors came up to me and he said, hey, that was a good idea you staff came up with. And I said, we came up with it. I thought you came up with it. And then we realised that actually the senior minister in that particular instance hadn't told us all what was going on. And that's where that birthed in me the idea, wouldn't it be good if the parish council and the pastors and the ministry coordinators could meet together, and then the parish council could meet separately to fulfil its legal obligations formally. So we put that organic structure of what we call the executive, Soul Revival executive, together in order to facilitate communication. It's also really effective because it gets things done quicker. So if someone wrote a letter to the parish council saying, can we have a basketball hoop for the youth group, and we want to put it in the car park, then the parish council would then have to go around and talk to other stakeholders and say, what do you think about the basketball hoop? But because of the executive, the parish council can be sitting with ministry heads, of which the youth ministry can say, can we have a basketball hoop? And in the room is the kids ministry who say, well, actually, we were thinking about building a playground. And then together the group can go, okay, they're 2 good ideas. How can we all talk about that and see which has priority for now? And the youth group might go, well, actually, that's a really good idea. We should put our resources into the playground first. We could do the basketball hoop better. And then the parish council can go and vote whether they even have a basketball hoop or a playground or what they do first, but they've heard the community and the pastor's view on that. So it's really effective, it's really efficient, and it's also allowing for really good communication. The other thing is it's more representative. So we only have 6 parish councillors and 2 wardens. However, the group I described together is about 30 leaders. And so you get 30 people coming together, which is a broader cross-section and better representative of the whole church. Now, added to that, what we did was instead of just having a council executive, we also have once a term something we call the full council. And that council takes all the local gathering coordinators of ministries with their central coordinators the pastors and the elected representatives, and that has up to 70 people in that meeting. Now, some people might say that's unwieldy. You do have to have certain dynamics at play to make that work, but it does work. And it actually means breakout rooms and also a combination of coming together for a big formal meeting can actually have a lot of benefit, and that's an organic structure. So that's the Yellow Submarine for us, because we can have a lot of younger people. You know, we do get some young adults elected to the parish council, but we get a lot of younger people in the full council and some in the executive. We also have a really good representation of men and women in those full and executive councils and on parish council too. But it just gives a lot more scope for a really big group of people to help run the church. So that's our organic structure that we talked about on Wednesday.
Yeah, and I hear you talking about the AGM. That only happens once a year, and there are some younger people elected to that, and men and women as well, like you said. But if we only had that, that's just one-off time, where the council is once a month. It's that connection point between the organic and the formalised structures that kind of eventually reaches a peak in the AGM, but then it starts again, and it's another yearly cycle.
Yeah. So you're right. We have that, but also added to that, once a term at least, we have what we call a commitments meeting, which is for all committed Christians who want to stay back after one service a term to have a forum to have a bit of feedback from the local community. So not everyone's in leadership, but everyone gets an opportunity to talk about the culture and share what they think about it. And it helps a multi-site church continue to work together theologically and culturally, so that it's not just like all this big diverse group of people. As we've grown bigger, the commitments are helping us to keep a theological and a cultural shape that means that our theology and our strategy can be continually talked about, particularly in a church like ours that's got quite a few people now, a lot more than in the early days. So that works well, the commitments meeting. And on top of that, we do one last organic thing, which is a planning day. Now, some churches do a planning day once every 5 years or something like that. We do one every year. And the idea of that is it gives everyone a bit more of a context to talk together across the gatherings and come up with solutions to problems. We ask the question, what are we doing that we should keep doing? What are the things that we should stop doing? And what are new things we can do? And we do that once a year as well. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a picture of the whole.
There's also a spectrum between like what's a bit more institutional, what's a bit more organic, isn't there?
Yeah, well? That's a good point. Yeah. So it's really nice because you've got those formal structures and then you have the organic structures. And in our context, they seem to complement each other. A lot of people who come from other churches to our church sometimes either don't understand or don't fully embrace the organic structures because they sort of think, oh, it's a bit hippie. But that's the problem with the Yellow Submarine. It goes below the surface a bit and some people don't relate to it. So we always use the third place theory of regulars and irregulars to give people permission to say, oh yeah, I don't get all that. And we don't, force people to participate in the organic structures, but they're there if they would like to. And of course, on top of the organic structures and the formal structures, there's informal relationships people have in ministry where Christians just serve and minister out of the gifts the Holy Spirit's given them to do as well. So yeah, there's that kind of formal, informal aspect to it as well.
Can I ask you, there's just one more question kind of about these organic and institutional structures. You've mentioned being, it's one of the intentions of it is to be representative. Why do you think that's so important? Because sometimes maybe parishioners are kind of separated from the kind of institutional structures. Yeah,
well, some people get marginalised from this church structures, and churches can become cliquey, and all human communities can become cliquey. But the good thing about having these organic structures helps people that might not normally have a voice to have a voice. Those bottom-up voices actually get recognised in our approach. Well, they're formally recognised, as well as the top-down. It came from our youth ministry days and my reading in the 90s originally. Mark Center we talk about a lot. Mark Center in his book, The 4 Views of Youth Ministry, he says in his article on his approach he calls a strategic approach to youth ministry. He says one of the problems local churches have is that adults in the church don't listen to young people until they turn 30. And a lot of young people don't hang around till they're 30
to even be listened to.
To even be listened to, because they don't have a voice, they don't get listened to. And a preparatory approach to ministry would kind of be an approach where an adult congregation see the young people as the church of the future, not of the church of today, and that the role of youth and kids ministry is to train them how the adults want them to copy their model in the future. But organic structures never stay the same, and culture never stays the same. But sometimes churches can become static and stagnant because the older generation don't want to change and they don't want the young people to bring new ideas. And that's what can cause a greying of the church, because young people just don't hang around. They either look for a church that is more friendly to young people, or they leave the church altogether. And we're currently losing something like 40% of our young people in Anglican churches in Sydney today. So the idea of the organic structures is to say, okay, what if we create a third place for young people and adults to come together to put the shock absorber into practice? Because what we need is, it's good for kids to have youth groups where they can have their own space to experiment. And again, I refer to Kenda Creasy-Dean in her book Practicing Passion, which was iconic in that explanation. It's good to have a youth group, but then it's also good to have an intergenerational church service that those young people can come to engage with the adults. So we started a formal time before the service once a month for young and old to come together in a commitments meeting, for them to share their experiments with the rest of the church and to listen to what are the formal structures they actually do need to keep perpetuating that aren't up for grabs. So that creates an interplay for the shock absorber that I think includes more voices so that people can actually help shape the direction of the church. And in our context, it has we don't have formal figures on it, but I think we have a higher retention rate of teenagers because they actually have a voice in the church. My funnest moment on Wednesday night was when you and your daughter got up and you interviewed her. And she's what? How old is she now? 10. So she's 10 years old, and she got up to tell us what she thought about being a Christian at school and what she thought about being a Christian at church, and what did she think we were doing well and what were some things we could do better. And my favourite moment of that little interview was when you said, "So how are you finding tonight?" And she said, "It's boring."
A bit boring.
But we had a 10-year-old girl, a 10-year-old sister, Christian, who's the young person who's the church of today, not the church of tomorrow. And she was a bit bored in that context. But then we also in our church have these structures where she can actually have a voice. Now that in some way it was just a small example of what we're trying to do, but it's still aspirational for us, and that's why we call it a Yellow Submarine. Yeah. It's a bit countercultural.
Yeah, it's very cool. And you've also, and I think one of the ideas around the organic structures is one that you've brought up is the circles of friendship. We kind of inspired by Bonhoeffer, which he called, and he's inspired by Jesus. And you've mentioned talking about costly discipleship as well, and also how we can become cliquey as humans. And it was really cool that Julie, a great friend of ours who was part of Soul Revival, and then her and Tom and her family moved up to Orange, where they're actually have planted a church as part of their church. It was really cool. But she had a question about the friendship circles and groups. So it'd be interesting to see how we apply this organic institutional framework to her question. And so she's got two. But the first question is, from a Christian perspective, do you think the friendship circles groups idea are mixed with Christians and non-Christians, or is it specifically just for Christians?
I think it's a really cool question. Just to recap for those that haven't heard the episode, which is only a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, if you can just, what's it called? Friendship circles even maybe, or something? Friendship in church or something? Or we can put a link to it. But basically the idea is that while the Gospels aren't prescriptive, telling us that everything that Jesus and the disciples did in their early journey is something that we are necessarily going to do now. What we see in Jesus's friendship group is, and it is a friendship group because Jesus himself calls his disciples friends in John 15:15. I no longer call you servants, I call you my friends. What you see there that has been noticed is that Jesus has 3 disciples that are present at all of the major events in his life: the transfiguration, the garden before he goes to crucifixion are 2 examples, and those are James, Peter and John. Now, having 3 really close friends hasn't stopped Jesus having a bigger group of friends that he called the disciples, who are the 12. Having the 12 hasn't restricted him to only having 12 friends, because he has the 72 that he sends out. On top of that, we think that probably by the time he goes to the crucifixion, he's probably got about a community following him of about 120 people. So the context has been noticed that you can have 3 really close friends, you can have a medium-sized group, or a small group of friends of 12, and a medium-sized group of 72, and then 125 people in a bigger group. Now, again, it's not prescriptive, but it's an interesting model that as I look at our church at Soli's, we have 7 gatherings, and within those gatherings, I'm thinking to myself, people will have very close friends, and they might have a small group of friends. But sometimes in our churches in Sydney, we can stop including other people into that friendship group. We still go to the church, which has the 125, the bigger context. But I think in our context in Sydney, we're missing the medium-sized group, where groups of friends can come together and say, we might not be as close as the 3 or the 12, but we're still friends. And that actually helps us to include more people who come to church. And that's why we have a commitments group. Commitments meaning committed Christians who come together as Christians to disciple one another, to be on mission. So in that context, the answer to Julie's question is, in that theological context, those groups do relate to Christian friends very helpfully within the expression of the local church, but not exclusively, because we can have 3 close Christian friends and then be bigger parts of bigger Christian friendship groups that are broader than just one local church. But that doesn't mean this idea is only restricted to Christians. But what it does recognise is that only Christians are brothers and sisters. So the ecclesial category of Christian friendship is only applied to Christians. We only call Christians the body of Christ. We only call Christians the spiritual house that's being built together, the family of God. We are Christians in that. So the consequence, though, is what I love about Jesus' ministry is he taught his disciples amongst the crowds. So when he gathered the 12 together, and presumably the 72 and the 125, he did it in wilderness places where there were so many people that he needed to perform the miracle of the fish and the loaves. Now, in that context, again, sociology is really helpful, because the third place theory of Oldenburg says that within any community you have regulars and irregulars. And in a Christian community, you can have friendship with non-Christians and be friends with non-Christians, but that friendship with Jesus is missing in that friendship. So what makes these circles of friendship work is Jesus is our friend, he's our best friend, and we are friends with each other because we're friends with Jesus. But then we can still be friends in public. In other words, be engaged in partnership evangelism as we do discipleship even publicly as well, as much as we can, and we evangelize. So a symbol of that for us is we have our Easter service down at a local park on the river, where we get about 250 to 300 people come to that service, which is also has baptisms, but it's in public. So you'll get someone get up to speak, and someone will be cleaning their motor of their boat at the same time as the speaker's trying to talk over the top of the motor, which is quite delightful. Now, when it comes to Christian and non-Christian friendships, there is an exclusivity of being the family of God, but that doesn't mean we're exclusive only to be friends with people who are Christians. Of course we're friends with other people. The dynamics change, though, when we're friends with non-Christians, because the two friends that are friends with each other, the Christian and the non-Christian, don't have a third person in that relationship. Only one person has the third person in that relationship, which is Jesus. So that's what I think might be a helpful way of thinking about friendships. I've got lots of non-Christian friends. I mean, I'm the chaplain at Cronulla Sharks, and I've got mates in the wellbeing team who are really good friends after 10 years. And they're not Christians. We're really good mates. I've got lots of friends from school and uni and workplaces and all that. But the Christian friendship dynamic described by Bonhoeffer is a Christian friendship.
I do think like the gathering together thing, though, as Christians publicly, is also a way of like standing out, kind of what you're talking about of not being like the world, in terms of what you were talking about previously. But also, I wonder what the element is of like wanting to, how much we want to welcome other people into that friendship group. But we also most importantly want them to become a Christian. Yeah,
and that's called evangelism, isn't it? And we can be present in the world, and we can be helpful to people in the world, and we can be just be friends and be present. But I think the idea of Jesus's Great Commission is to say, go out into all the world and tell people about me, and that's why he sent out the 72, the medium-sized group, to go and tell people, prepare the way for the Lord, go and tell people about Jesus. So, yeah, I take evangelism super seriously as a Christian. I don't know that I'm particularly good at it, but I just love partnering with Jesus as he calls more people into the church. So people come to a church service, but you actually don't belong in the church until you belong to Jesus. That's what makes us belong.
Yeah. Well, the episode, if you want to know more about that, is called Have We Forgotten About Friendship? Was from about 3 weeks ago. There's the other question, though, from Julie when she's talking about church planning, and she asks, at what stage are kids and youth included in your numbers?
That's a good question.
Is it an organic ideal and perception dependent? Like it kind of depends on how the church service operates and who's there and what's going on. It's just she's interested to know like where and when do we include kids and youth in our numbers?
Yeah, so we do include kids and youth, and we also do count people of different demographics as well. We do both end. So we on any weekend would count the number of children and the number of teenagers and adults who come to the church as one number. I think a couple of weeks ago, Jai was telling me we had our second biggest number of people who'd come to church over a weekend. And then we would not only count that number, but we'd also count how many adults are coming and how many youth are coming. So because of modern technology and there's some great tools out there, we little shout out to Church Suite, really good program for this sort of stuff. We can actually really care for people carefully by having an understanding of how many kids and youth are also members of our church and how many adults are members of our church too. So we kind of do both. And then when we report on the attendances or membership, we report the big number and then we report the breakdown of that.
Yeah, and I think it also fits with what we like to say is that the youth and our children are the church of today, not just the church of tomorrow. And
yeah,
I think
that's right.
That's important, I think, for also our intergenerational model of that we want to be friends with our youth and our even younger people from the moment they are part of the church. And we just as much belong as Christians, like you said, as they do if they're Christians as well, and they have very much an ability to have their own faith as well.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, it's awesome.
Cool. All right, so Tim, we need to wrap up the episode. Tim's not here for Tim's takeaway.
I'm not sure what the Tim takeaway is.
Tim's takeaway is just what would you like to think about going out of this episode?
Oh, okay, right, yep.
So here's an interesting question to pose you. See if we can mold all this together, because we were going to talk about also how we respond as Christians in regards to looking at our institutional and organic structures, about how things are changing in our world. And especially right now, we're seeing that there's things like economic issues coming up because of the fuel crisis.
Yeah, sure.
Caused by what's going on in Iran.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to think, you're obviously a bit older than me, and like you kind of grew up partly in the Cold War as well, as an example, where there was an existential threat of like people might shoot nuclear weapons at each other.
Yeah.
And fortunately in Australia, we were pretty much unaffected by large-scale things like that. I'm just wondering, as we go into, I've threw out a few articles at you before about that one of the headlines was "Drongo economic policy is not where we should go," which I thought was very Australian. But what do you think? What are you thinking now as a Christian? You're a leader. People are going to likely struggle financially in some certain ways. How do we kind of take those organic and institutional structures and to be able to help people as Christians?
Yeah, just a couple of points. So I had a great privilege of growing up in a household where our grandparents lived with us, and my grandparents lived through the Second World War, and they lived in a city called Sheffield in England that was regularly bombed in the Second World War in what was called the Blitz. And so I grew up with a lot of stories from that. And the stories basically were stories of how do everyday people adjust to dramatic, violent change. So in a nightly air raid that was almost every night, they had to go into the backyard in a hole they've dug in the backyard with some tin over it and dirt on top, which was called an Anderson shelter, and they went into that shelter every night. So my pop tells a funny story of one night he was so sick of going into this damp, musty hole in the ground to sleep because the bombs were coming that he stayed in bed. But anti-aircraft fire that was firing up at the Heinkels that were flying over him, some of the particles of the exploded bombs came through into his bedroom, through his bedroom ceiling, and landed. He said he was lying in bed and the shrapnel, red hot steel, landed right between his legs. And he just got out of bed, and he reckons there were 13 stairs on the way down to the next floor, and he reckoned he touched 3 of them on the way down, and he went running into the shelter.
Wow, yeah.
So that was kind of fun to hear that story. My nan would tell the story of where she'd be going to the shops and both sides of the street were bombed out completely. And one day she found a dozen eggs in the middle of the street that were completely uncracked, and she took them home. But then she shared them with the neighbour. So the stories were often stories of sharing. She'd say that she'd have to go to work, but the bus station had been bombed out and everyone didn't have a bus, but people would still wait at the bus stops, and people would stop and pick them up and take them to work. And I was so struck by all those stories that when I studied political science, I did a honours thesis paper on the Blitz and looked at how do people, everyday people, reorganise themselves when the formal structures of the society break down. And often they replace them with organic structures and they can work together. Interestingly, a study came out in the 90s that said that people in the 1990s were more stressed than people who lived through the Blitz. And they put that down to the fact that people in wartime have less choices. And so it's less complicated to go about your life. And the article was saying back in the 90s, which is a long time ago now, that there were so many different soft drinks that you could choose when you go to a corner store to buy a soft drink that you often left with purchaser guilt because you're not sure if you should have bought the Fanta or the Diet Fanta or the Extra Fanta with green flavour. And you kind of, back in the day, once upon a time, you'd probably just get some water if you were lucky, and so there wasn't a lot of choice. So funnily enough, it can actually be less stressful living under extreme stressful conditions. But the more we have, the more entitlement we have, and the more selfish and individualistic we get, because we live our lives according to our consumer choices, not according to survival. And I think what we got a glimpse of in COVID was some of the excesses of dangerous situations that communities can actually fall into that are the opposite of what my grandparents told me. Now, I'm not just saying that everyone in the Blitz helped everyone. There were people who were robbing from people and black markets and selfish behaviour and stuff. But apparently in one street in Atterclift in Sheffield, there was a mini riot when someone threw out their banana peel in a bin publicly in front of everyone. And someone yelled out, "Do you know our men are dying to get those bananas across the Atlantic, and you can't even put that in the compost? You've wasted that banana skin and put it in the thing." So there was kind of like an accountability in the community that everyone shouldn't be living for themselves. They should be thinking of helping other people. So one house would grow tomatoes, another house would grow potatoes, and everyone would share the tomatoes and the potatoes. While it wasn't perfect, I didn't see a lot of that during COVID. When we had COVID, which is our closest version to that, I mean, you talked about the existential threat of the Cold War. We could talk about that later. Yeah. that was a heightened awareness of the danger we still live with nuclear weapons, really. But in COVID, as soon as COVID was announced, there's this mass panic quickly, and people just bought toilet paper.
The toilet paper, yeah.
And there were people fighting each other over toilet paper. And I heard a story a couple of years ago that someone in our area knows someone whose garage is still full of toilet paper because that person just went out and bought as much toilet paper as they could, and now they can't get rid of it, and they've still got this big pile of toilet paper. And you see this similar thing with this Iran war. I'm not seeing hey, I tell you what, I'll grow tomatoes, you grow potatoes. I'm seeing people like doing the toilet paper thing.
Stockpiling fuel.
So everyone's stockpiling fuel, people, and we've got a prepper culture now, which even though that's a niche culture, subculture within our community, there are people who are only thinking of themselves, and you can see websites and buy books that teach you how not to share your stuff if the world goes south. What to do when your neighbours come and say, hey, you seem to have enough food, can you share some with me? And in America, some of those preppers have guns and bug out strategies and strategies for defending themselves and their resources from other people. Has our culture changed? I don't know. I'm not sure. But it's very different to the stories of my grandparents. I don't know what's going to happen or how long this crisis is going to go. But the lesson I take from my grandparents' stories seems to be closer to the gospel imperatives that I read in the Bible than some of our current behaviours, which are very individualistic and self-protective. If we really do believe that our God is looking after us and he's providing for all our needs, then we can share during times of need as much as we can. And I did see examples of that in COVID. Maybe it wasn't the sort of things that was getting on the news. But, when people are thinking of each other and trying to help each other get through, the Christian response is to think of those who are in most need and people who have plenty trying to share with those who don't have plenty. And how do we work together to look after each other during those times? But how do we as the Christian community look after our broader community as well? And so I think my prayer with what's going on today with this war is that we don't slip into the panic buying of toilet paper and we don't rely on finding a dozen eggs in the middle of a bombed out street, but we do trust in the Lord and seek to share what we have with each other and with others in need. I don't know if it's going to last a long time or a short time. Whichever way it is, I think that we can try and support the formal structures of our society, do what we're asked with fuel rationing, if that's something that we have to do. My grandparents were still having ration cards into the 50s, 10 years after the war, because there was such scarcity in England after the war. But, if we have to do that, let's, drive 1 day a week or 2 days or, only get this much fuel on these days. Let's do that. But my hope is that as Christians, we can create organic structures in this time that supplement and complement those formal ideas from the government, and that we seek to care for each other, care for those in need.
I like that. That's a great way to finish the episode. Thank you very much, Stu. Had a good time with you today.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It's been great. And if you are interested in what we're talking about or you want to chat about it, you can join the Shockabsorber network by going to shockabsorber.com.au and clicking the link to join our mailing list. Or you can just email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au. But for now, we'll say goodbye. We'll see everyone next week. Thank you, Shu. We didn't have cameras today, but we should hopefully have them next week. But we still wanted to put out an episode. Thank you for everyone listening. Thank you, Stu, and we'll finish with a one way.
One way.